This is Monica Perez here with Roger Huang, the author of Would Mao Hold Bitcoin? The Past, Present, and Future of Bitcoin in Techno-Nationalist China. And that title just says it all. We're going to talk for an hour, and I'm sure just pulling that apart, unpacking it, as they say, could take that whole time. So thank you so much, Roger, for joining us and giving us the benefit of your research and insights.
Monica, love the show. Thank you so much for inviting me. And if any of you or your viewers hear any background noise, it's because I'm currently in sunny El Salvador, so can't really control that. But looking forward to this conversation.
Yeah, but we had a little technical difficulties. That's why we're starting a bit late, but you're on your phone and it's working great. And I appreciate that. And I think I always find it most interesting to kind of get to know a little bit of the background of you and why you were interested in this topic, how, why you decided to write the book, what's it about. I like to do when somebody writes a book, I want to introduce it to my audience. It's really an overview.
Yeah.
What are they going to get out of that book? And I want to know kind of what your purpose was and how you do the whole package.
Yeah, no, perfect. So for me, I've been writing about Bitcoin since 2014. And when I first got into it, it was really just to try to understand it. I've also been writing about China for quite a bit of a while, both from a policy, history, a literature lens. I was born in China and have spent quite a bit of time there. Now I do live in Canada, but used to go back and forth a little bit more often than I do now. So that's kind of a little bit of the background story. And I really wrote the book because I wanted to understand it's really the cutting edge of, I think, geopolitics and technology writ large. In understanding the Chinese model, the one thing you have to understand is that the Chinese model is about leapfrogging across, the American and kind of the Western model through technical development, right? And the idea is, well, can you find technological movements and paradoxes that can kind of supersede that? And Bitcoin to me always fascinated me, especially in the context of China, because you have a place where the government is trying so hard to block and ban this technology in different ways, but then you still see incredible amounts of interest in Bitcoin from Chinese people, from Chinese entrepreneurs, some of which made some of the lasting businesses that define Bitcoin today. And so that was kind of, as I was trying to explore that in the book. So I wanted to do three things, really. I wanted to explain enough about China to people in the West and Bitcoiners and people who are trying to understand a little bit more about China there. I wanted to understand a little bit more about the intersect between Bitcoin and China, just myself, just being curious and trying to put that together after having done a lot of writing and research on the topic, really just consolidating it. But the third thing I really wanted to do is more of this idea of bridging these different contexts and these different ideas, right? And when these two ideas are so paradoxical, like when you think about Bitcoin and you think about the Chinese Communist Party, can two ideas be more antithetical? But yet they coexist in some places and they also clash in some others. So it's always really interesting to look deeper into those topics.
So this is something that's kind of like jumping to forward, but when the way we think about communist countries, we think of them as totally backwards and behind, lower standard of living, lower tech, all of that stuff. Yet China seems to be unique in several ways in that topic. One is, you look at North Korea and Vietnam and we call them communist and we're like, this is proof communism fails. But you look at China and it's, wildly successful. And then you look at Russia, the history of Russia, Stalin kind of had, he was lauded for some industrial advancements. And then in the 90s, or I guess starting in the 80s, there was, I don't know what sparked the unrest. It seemed to hit both China and Russia. And in Russia, they gave political freedoms at the same time, or instead of economic freedom. In China, they gave economic freedom without political freedom. That seemed to work better. How do you classify what kind of government China is? Why is it different? Why is its experience so different from those other places? And how can something command and control, which should be so inefficient, result in cutting edge technology?
Yeah, this is kind of like the crux of, when you talk about geopolitics and what the Chinese model is, what is China right now? This is a very, very significant question. I think the first thing to start with is that, the China of today is very different from the China of Mao, right? With the China of Mao, you really had these clear divisions. You had basically, if you were called a capitalist voter, this was during the Cultural Revolution of the 1970s, then that might have meant a death sentence for you, right? Or struggle sessions or things like that. Now we live in a China that was built by Deng Xiaoping. And Deng Xiaoping was the leader after Mao. And Deng Xiaoping said, it's glorious to get rich. It doesn't matter if it's a white cat or a black cat. So much as the cat catches mice, it's a good cat, right? So this kind of like pragmatism. But I think you hit on a point which was very, very astute when it comes to studying China, which is that the Chinese people have a lot more economic freedom in certain respects, especially in how to earn money, and especially in this idea of, money being something that people should strive for, right? Previously with Mao, it was a communist society. People worked in communes. They were not allowed to work in private enterprise. If you had a private enterprise that profited privately, like you were going to be shut down by the state, right? And now that doesn't really happen as much. It doesn't happen at all, actually, really, in China. Like you can start private companies. There are, of course, restrictions in different ways, but by and large, you are able to earn money. So you see this kind of strange combination of markets, relatively free, certainly freer markets than Mao, but I would argue not like fully free markets. And at the same time, increasing political repression. And there's always two things I say when people ask me about this. The first is like, it's not necessarily as unique as people think initially. The scale of it is, right? But, if you remember the Asian tigers, like if you remember South Korea, if you remember Taiwan and how they kind of grew with their export-led growth models, both of those countries were actually authoritarian states when they saw kind of the beginnings of that economic growth curve. I think what China's probably going to have to confront is that there hasn't necessarily been a country of China's scale. I mean, to be fair, there is no, China and India are basically the only comparators in terms of population. But, when it comes to these kind of different models, China's kind of made that leap to where South Korea was after the military dictatorship, to where Taiwan was going even when Chiang Kai-shek ruled under effectively one-party rule and martial law. But what we see is like when those states like fully develop, into that model where they're closer to that 50,000, GDP per capita USD or something or thereabouts, there is a little bit of a switch. In Taiwan, you saw there became the beginning of elections. And then in South Korea, the military dictatorship also was converted into a democracy as well. So a lot of paradox, but we have seen some versions of the story before, right? So that's just something I always bring up. And then the second thing is, I think that, sometimes it doesn't really matter what the name is, if that makes sense. Like
Yeah, totally. Yeah.
we can argue back and forth, like, is this socialism? Is this capitalism? In fact, what China itself calls itself is socialism with Chinese characteristics, right? But but what does that mean? What does that mean? And I tell people to look more at the actions of the government and the policy and kind of like what's happening.
So, in one thing, so you talk about the Asian tigers and our conversation, that things I've heard you say sound like very organic, but you can also look at what would be the impact on a country with the exact same economic and political ideology that had total sanctions from the world versus one that was given most favored nation trading status. Like, what
Correct.
difference could that make? So my father was, my parents, extremely anti-communist. Like, they were mad at Carter when he abandoned Taiwan.
Right.
They wouldn't buy goods from China. So he was upset that we gave China most favored nation trading status when there were freer countries that didn't have it.
Right.
And I wonder if you have an opinion on the impact that that has had in the divergence of some of these economies.
Yeah, I think there is a classic American policy mistake, which is to underestimate kind of the like almost like long held trends. And so the WTO ascension, which you're referring to, the World Trade Organization ascension, which effectively consolidated China, I believe 2001. China basically played itself out and kind of played bide your strength with time. The idea was to kind of like really play up, I don't think China's economic growth, the export-led model, would have succeeded at all if it was not part of the WTO ascension. And I think the United States probably made two fatal errors in this regard. One is in, thinking that freer markets would automatically equal freer people. And as we see in China, don't think that is necessarily the case. And then secondly, not only was there the World Trade Organization ascension, but in fact, the United States completely focused elsewhere for decades at a time. And specifically, I was reading this book, it was kind of really interesting about the inner workings. I think it was published by someone who worked at the CIA. And it was, I think in 2011 or 2012. And that person was writing entirely about how like the CIA should totally reorient itself, understand Arabic, prioritize the hiring of people who speak Arabic and, and who are well versed in the Middle East. And I'm not saying the Middle East doesn't have a bunch of different issues or geopolitical issues, but it was clear to me that this was kind of like a whole, almost like from the United States after the WTO ascension, which would have been the moment to have really understood, the implications of the Chinese model, suddenly kind of like reversed course and veered off and kind of spent years and decades fighting lost wars in like different places.
I don't know how deep down. Oh, sorry. Go ahead.
Oh, sorry. What were you saying? It kind of
Oh,
cut out.
I didn't want to interrupt you. Sorry. I wonder, I don't know how deep down the rabbit hole you go, but do you think that there's any chance there are competing factions here where one will that the policy, they aren't policy errors, but there are elements in the power structure that want an ascension from China? I've heard and read and listened to analyses that say the Rockefellers, sent tech to China, that there was some like Walmart had some deals there, that there was backroom dealing. And I don't, that's not what you get into in your book, so I don't want to derail you at all. But I just wondered if you have an opinion on that.
I have brief comments. I have written about this outside of my book. So two things. One is that China is very good at co-opting elite politics. And we see this in, for example, the European Union. I actually wrote a story about how there was a Chinese tied entity to the United Front, which is kind of China's way of influencing elites around the world, whether that's through like contributions, whether that's through nice trips to China and things like that.
We see it here. We see it here. It's definitely here. I mean, I don't know how deep or how big it is, but you can actually identify people and relationships and events that tie into that. It's almost kind of not really that secret.
Yeah. Well, I mean, it's
bit,
public.
but not totally.
Yeah, if you look up my byline, Roger Huang, Bitcoin Magazine, you'll see I have an article entirely, and we traced it down to like there was actually some contributions in the American system, and that were made by a Chinese home company, for example, things like that. And this was a network of donors and donations and contributions that spread out to lots of sitting Congress people. Even got a quote from then Vice President Kamala Harris and now defeated presidential candidate Kamala Harris, saying, like one of the donors was a really good friend of hers and things like that. So the elite politics side, like for sure, there is some level of, and I don't think, I will say this, like, I think American politics is at the point where and I think the Chinese leadership have established as much, like, you're not going to get someone who's like super, super overtly pro-China, I don't think, just because of the way the politics are running out. But there certainly are attempts to use and wield China's, ability to be able to curry influence, whether that's through like, state media, whether that's through contributions, whether that's through anything else, all the things that politicians care about, right? Like votes and money. So that definitely does happen. What you mentioned in terms of the companies, I will say there are probably a lot of Americans who, because of the uniqueness of the Chinese model we described, definitely wanted China to succeed because it helped fill their pockets. And they were either on the board of Chinese companies or they invested significantly in China. And an example of this, I'll just be really specific because I actually wrote about this in Forbes of all places. But Charlie Munger, has and Berkshire have made no qualms of saying how much they've invested in China over the years. And I think Charlie has gone so far as to even defend the Chinese Communist Party in
Yeah.
many ways, saying that their methods are more brutal than we would expect according to our constitution, but are understandable. It says how to still represent good policy. So I wrote this kind of piece a long time ago. And I mean, I don't know. I guess you don't want to speak ill of the dead. I guess that might be a bad example in that, but I did write about that, and it follows a trend. There were a couple people. I don't want to name specific names because I don't want to like be sued or libeled or something.
Yeah, no,
But
you can't.
yeah. But like if you look up just people who are on the boards even of like Chinese companies and things like that, you do see former politicians, you see former generals, you see all those people. So
I'm
there
gonna name
definitely are some
some
people.
names. If
Yeah,
you wouldn't mind, Hunter Biden, that whole thing was
sure.
crazy that he's on the board of, Bohai Harvester or whatever, and I don't think he put the money in as an investor, yet he's treated as an investor, which is really I think it could we don't know how much it's worth, but it could be worth billions of dollars, and he's like, "Okay, I'll step down from the board." I was like, "No, you need to divest yourself of" you know what I mean? Walk away from this
Yeah,
investment. So it definitely it's there, and but I feel like in a way it's almost straightforward, and I always look at the backroom dealings of if you talk
mm,
about the Middle East, it's super opaque. Like you just don't know what's really going on. You can
yeah.
guess, but with this, it looks pretty straightforward. I can see that.
Yeah, definitely a couple of names. I actually don't remember the specific names, so I just don't want to. When I
Yeah,
said I don't want to be sued or libeled, I don't want to misname the guy. But I
yeah, yeah,
remember there was a former NATO general who was on the board of several Chinese companies,
yeah. I remember
and I
that. Yeah.
think like yeah, and you could definitely have like a number of these stories. So definitely a lot of interesting stuff there. I'm glad, always glad to get into this rabbit hole because I actually do write about that aside from all this other stuff.
Yeah, oh, that's great, and I would love it if you would give me the links to all the different things that we talk about and places that we can find you. I'll put it in the show notes, which I make a
Yeah,
post, monicapereshow.com. Uh, so a couple of more things in this vein, and then I want to uh, hear a little bit more about you. When I look at I'm basically just asking you all the questions I have about China. So
it's
I
fine.
hope that's okay. You don't have to if you don't know it, like there's no reason you should know everything. But I look at the cooperation, the coordination, or at least the parallel policies that were adopted in China, as well as the US and around the world, with the possible exception of Africa during COVID. And
Mm,
it looks like we were on the brink of world government, like, it was just so cooperative. And then I
mm,
see the real machinations around, isolating, China from, particularly the super advanced semiconductor chips, like
yeah,
AI stuff, keep them away from Taiwan. Anyone who sells any parts to anyone, that looks very real to me. The CHIPS Act was a big thing here that really went out of its way to support companies that don't pay anything to China and get people to like not trade with China in order to get free money from us, which to me, that's fascism. That's us paying our government paying for the benefit of corporations that they control. But do you at what level do are we friendly, and at what level are we competitors? Is it and both on the world stage and corporate wise? Like, do you see the kind of like I'm confused by the layers of where the competition
yeah.
starts and the cooperation ends?
Yeah, no, I could. No, I think that's a question with a lot of layers. So let me try to unpack that a little bit. One thing I will say is that, some of these things I think are not necessarily, a China United States thing. It's just like extension of like states trying to maximize their power and to, apply themselves. And I think that it expresses itself in different ways in different models. But to give you an example, like I know later on we might talk about the Hong Kong protests, and the Hong Kong protests were really shut down because of COVID restrictions. Like they used COVID restrictions in a political way. For example, one of the super spreader events, quote unquote, or whatever, was in Hong Kong. It was actually run by Hong Kong politicians. The Hong Kong police were very
Oh.
careful about that, right? But when it came to assemblies of people for any reason, it suddenly became this thing where, hey, because of COVID, like you can't gather, you can't, and that really actually did sap a lot of the momentum. So I do see, commonalities. And it's not to say that China and the US are allies when they do that. It's just to say that, the states have the same incentives. It's like once you have a state of emergency or a state of exception, how do you squash dissidents, right? Just because China and the US are kind of leveraging that to the extent that they can, that doesn't necessarily mean they're allies, if that makes sense. It just means that they are, yeah.
Yeah. I've thought of that with regard to Russia. So why doesn't Putin come out and
Yeah.
reveal some of the military intelligence background of things like ISIS or 9/11? Why would he not do that? And my thinking is these are the tools and techniques of power and geopolitics, but also how you control your own population. And I'm not even saying that in a pejorative way. I'm not like control, but like it's just a pragmatic statecraft or whatever. Why would he
Yeah.
expose levers of power that he uses himself, which I'm sure he does? So I've thought of that too. Like you don't why blow that up? No reason to blow
Yeah.
up. Yeah. Okay.
So,
Interesting.
so
Yeah.
that part, yeah. But yeah, Monica, I think you're about to ask a question, so
Well, I was going to ask you I was going to change. I was going to ask a question that does not follow. So if there's anything more that you have to say about that, I think you answered the question quite well. But the thing about the chips is interesting to me. Like that seems like
yeah.
the most intense competition we have. And if you have any comments on that.
Well, let me follow up on that a little bit. Yeah, it's surprising to me. The United States has tried to apply some level of sanctions, but actually, China has still been able to develop chips, and really, American allies have been kind of reluctant to enforce some of these sanctions because it's actually the Netherlands and Japan that have a lot of the lithography techniques. I also write about this stuff every once in a while. So the chips part, the economic part is very real. One thing that most people may not remember is that the United States sanctioned Japan for something similar. Like
Like in
in
the
order to
80s?
take in the 80s, yeah, when Japan was rising economically.
Hmm.
And I see this as a more super inflated version of this because China is a credible military alternative. Japan never was, as well as a potentially a separate currency block with the digital yuan and the CBDC,
Yeah.
central bank digital currency, and everything that we'll probably dig into that a little bit
Yeah. We're
deeper.
going to do that. Yeah.
But certainly China is like much more of a credible alternative. But there seems to be this idea in terms of competition. The United States has enforced even on traditional allies. I mean, for example, America wrote Japan's constitution. When there seems to be economic parity, I think the United States does take action. The United States sanctioned, the United Kingdom and the pound during the Suez Canal crisis. Japan had sanctioned, manufacturing and imposed tariffs on Japanese imports. And you're going to see a version of this play out with China. It's even more supercharged because China, I think, is the most credible. The United Kingdom was a fading power at that time and things like
Right.
that. So
We're the
I
fading
think
power. Yeah.
yeah, I think the competition part, like, I think it's very, very real because of these different factors. I think, but I also think that I don't know how effective it's been under the Biden administration, ironically,
I think it's a
paradoxically. Like, I
losing
do
battle.
think,
It's a losing battle, in my
yeah,
opinion.
yeah, I think you like the Biden administration hasn't been able to stop China from developing 7 nanometer chips, which are kind of 2 generations behind the most recent. And some of that is because you have pass through, like the world is a different place. Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates and all these other powers that have energy surpluses, they are more mercenary than they've been. I mean, I guess you could argue in the 70s they were very mercenary, but they've been more mercenary than they've been, at least for the last little while. So I do see there being some credible competition. I do think, though, that the United States, and this is a whole other topic, so I don't want to get too much into it, but like when it comes to military competition, I think I think the United States is probably seeing Russia more in terms of that, because China's
They
still kind
don't.
of biding its strength.
But
But
if you look at
but
budgets, we still are more than both. We're probably double both of them combined. The U.S.
yeah, well, China understates its military budget, to be
Right.
fair.
Okay.
But
We probably do too.
yeah, no. The one thing about China, though, is like from a manufacturing standpoint, if you start up from all the way, because American elites have given China the ability to manufacture and export at scale, China now
Yeah.
has the ability to build a lot more ships, for example, than the United States currently has right now. They just haven't, like, if you look at it from a stock perspective, America's Navy is still superior in many different dimensions than the Chinese
Right.
Navy. But if you look at it
Right.
from a flow perspective,
Yeah.
and the fact that China controls all the drone infrastructure, China controls
Right.
all these different
Right.
elements, if there were actually a war, because of the poor economic decisions that some American policy elites have made, China has much more of an upper hand than most people realize. I do think, though, that from a military standpoint, I mean, that's like, it's a little bit out of my pay grade. I'm not
Yep.
necessarily a military
Yeah.
analyst, but what I will say is, like, the competition part of that, I think probably the American state is underrating. I don't even know how to describe this, but the Chinese social media ecosystem and things like that really reminds me of like a revanchist kind of, maybe what France was like before the Franco-German Wars of like the 1870s or before World War I, right? And I think that feeling is very real. I don't know what they'll mean. I don't know exactly how or when a war might proceed. I hope that both parties avoid war.
Right.
But I think there are strong factors pulling for both, for some kind of conflict.
All right. So here I've got a segue, I guess, from a historical question to launch us into the conversation about currency. I remember reading, but I have no source or whatever. It's just, I read a lot of stuff and some stuff sticks in there and then I'm like, I don't even know where it came from. But that there if you went back long enough, you would see the development of East and West, let's say China and Europe. And China, like pre-industrial revolution, China was a very sophisticated civilization. And that a big difference that led to the industrial revolution happening in Europe rather than China is that they intentionally in China suppressed technology in order to not destabilize the hierarchy. Does that sound right?
Yeah, to a
Okay.
certain extent, yeah. Like, for example, with gunpowder, right?
Yeah, that I think that was the example. So, so it the reason I'm even saying that is not about suppressing technology, but it betokens a cultural difference, a profound cultural difference um, that allows for collective action, future-looking collective action versus our dog eat dog individualism, which definitely I would say, leads to more innovation. And I would say in a really free market, which we absolutely do not have, we would have, work less, have more, be healthier, happier, all of that. But we don't have any of that. But anyway, we do have that individualism, the legacy of that. And I assume China still has the legacy of a kind of cultural unity, maybe reinforced by the history of Mao. And so in that with that, now I see, I still think there's like a parallel thing where they seem to be very advanced technologically as far as where their currency is going, yet they suppress Bitcoin. And I don't know. Can you give us a little history of like I've heard you talk about the backstory of the evolution of currency and money in China and where they are now, where you think it's going. And I think that's that'll be a nice arc for what you talk about in your book.
Yeah, no, for sure. Definitely square into what the book covers. I mean, if we want to go all the way back, certainly the Chinese historical context, I think, like, I always harp on how there's just so many more cycles. I was reading this really interesting paper by MBER, and it was just like it made the argument that like the quantity theory of money was developed independently in China many centuries before, Milton Friedman and anyone else like kind of formalized it, and that's because China has was the site of the invention of paper money and credit money, Feiqian, as early as 800 900 AD. So when you have that history, you also see all the historical cycles. And so, not the only reason, but definitely a significant reason for why the Yuan dynasty, which was kind of Genghis Khan and the Mongols, and remember this, like, there was a Pax Mongolica that stretched from, Europe to Asia, and that all kind of fell apart because the Yuan dynasty could not control the money. So it was very interesting because the paper I read made the point that the yuan were very regulated in terms of how the paper money, so they were micro regulated. And I think of a lot of governments in that sense. They're like very, very prim and proper on what legal tender should be. It's like, it must be this, it must be redeemed at this rate, it must be this and that. But the government itself lost control of like how much like supply there was. Like first they switched it from a commodity backed money into a more purely fiat backed money. And
And
then
this
there was
was
just
paper money during Genghis Khan?
well, Kublai Khan or his
Right,
successor.
son.
Yeah, yeah,
Yeah,
yeah. Yeah, so it was basically like
that era. Yeah.
non-commodity backed
But
at
I
that
mean, it was
era.
made of, well, cloth probably, but, like, it
Well,
was
cloth, yeah, yeah, yeah. Cloth and
actually made of, wow.
no,
Yeah, how
I would have to go back to the notes to see if it was actually, but
wait, wait,
paper
how
was
would they
also
lose control of something like that, which they would have to produce, or could other people produce it?
well
They were was it
hyperinflation
like
happened.
making beer in Germany?
No,
So
no, no,
that,
no,
like,
no. But basically, that's exactly it, Monica. Like, essentially, they never lost control of how they produced the money, but they themselves lost control of
of
themselves.
right,
So there
okay,
was so much of
got
the
it, yeah,
money
got it.
being, and then also the government didn't collect taxes and also other stuff. But that led partially to the Yuan dynasty, the Ming dynasty, and you saw something similar
Yeah,
with the ascent of Mao Zedong because during that time period, I have this slide, I give this presentation all the time. And it's this young Chinese girl during the nationalist reign. This is during World War II or like right after World War II. And I know in the West, people always think of the example, the Weimar Republic. That's the easiest story of
yeah,
hyperinflation
yeah, yeah,
causing political upheaval, right? Weimar, wheelbarrows of money,
yeah.
Hitler rises to power, right? But people, I don't think know as much. China went through something very similar. So Chiang Kai-shek kind of lost control of the money supply, especially since of the war expenses and things like that.
Of course.
And yeah, and at one point, $10 at the time, which by now is probably worth. I mean, this is the other thing about inflation. We just never really counted out. But $10 then, back in the 1940s, probably like a few $100,000 now or something. I can't even really keep
In
track.
China, I
But
mean, it would double at least every 25 years. So let's say it would
yeah,
double $10, I would say would be 20, 40, 80.
I'm
Let's say
probably
100.
exaggerating, but
Yeah,
I'm
let's say
probably
$100.
exaggerating.
Here,
Let's say
10.
let's say 100 or something. Yeah, like 100 or 200. But the Chinese in China though it was $444,000
Right.
USD.
Yeah,
Like
that's just,
not USD, the
yeah,
unit that they had at the time. And they had wheelbarrows of money in the streets,
yeah.
just quick like huge amounts of
You can't live like that. You have to
money
stop using
just
money
kind of
then, and then you've got starvation
yeah, and actually
as
and
people
actually that's the
switch
thing
over
when
to
Mao
growing
took
their own food. Yeah.
yeah, and that was one of the reasons why Mao won out. And the People's Bank of China, even today, the Chinese central bank, still kind of harkens to that legacy because Mao created the People's Bank of China, created kind of this unified cloth-based currency that now is kind of that is the standard for China's currency. And they have always been mindful of inflation because of this historical episode. So the short summary of that is inflation has been a really important part of China's political and economic history. And Chinese people are actually quite sensitive to that, as well as Chinese central banks. Now, what that means for China now and what's going on, and where it's been really interesting, is you see that China is trying to ban Bitcoin. And I can go into specifics of what that means, but in favor of advancing its version of central bank digital currency, which it calls the digital yuan or the ECNY. The official name is kind of the ECNY, but people informally refer to it as the digital yuan. And even in the central bank, like it's kind of informally the digital yuan. But the thing with that is China is actually trying to advance a global standard. I think that the general idea is that central bank digital currencies probably are not going to be a thing for the West for a number of different reasons. It's just like really bad advertising. Right?
We're super
Government
afraid of it.
Yeah, I think Trump had the CBDC ban, and like there's a lot of people rallying behind that. It's a very easy target, right? In Canada, there was actually a rescindment of the digital Canadian dollar because I think something like 80% plus of Canadians said it was like a negative thing. But here's the thing, right? When it comes to the States or Canada, what always happens is you if you had LifeLogger, the CIA project, right? I
Yeah,
talked
yeah,
with
yeah.
Gabriel about this. That would
Yeah.
definitely be as unpopular, probably be as untenable, right? But if you have Facebook, the cool private sector
Yeah.
invested in by the same people entity, but look, you and your friends and all the young people are on it,
Yeah.
that's so exactly in the West. I think it's going to be, because Trump, for example, he's for a central bank digital currency ban, but his the head of his transition team is actually the custodian of Tether's treasury holdings, which is the largest stable coin in the world. Yeah, Howard Lutnick, I think his name is Lutnick.
Wow,
Yeah,
really?
yeah. So Cantor Fitzgerald is kind of like the custodian of. Short primer for people who don't know what stablecoins are. Basically, stablecoins are a cryptocurrency of sorts. It's a token where you can redeem a US dollar for every token. There's like an issuing company. And essentially what it allows you to do is it's kind of like a euro dollar, like it's like a foreign overseas version of the US dollar that's accessible to people without US dollar banking accounts, right? It holds its value in USD, but it's not Bitcoin per se because you don't have control over those funds. Like there is an issuer that can freeze those funds.
Yeah. Is it inflationary or
It's pegged to the
counter-inflationary?
US dollar. It's pegged to the
But
US
I mean,
dollar.
if it allows, I think like the euro dollar, I think would be considered highly inflationary, right? Because you're using or deflationary. Like I can see either way where if you have to turn them into dollars, it would reduce the supply of dollars. However, it's also a way of using dollars without using dollars. So it like in a way expands the supply of dollars, but it doesn't. I mean, it's not big enough at this point to
Well,
have a significant impact, right?
Well, you'd be surprised by that because Tether is actually probably going to be one of the net new largest buyers of treasuries. Because for each token
Oh,
that
oh, oh, because it buys
each
the
token,
treasuries. Okay, it
yeah,
holds
yeah,
it
yeah,
like
because
one
the
to
way they
one.
make
It's not
money,
fractional.
well, the way, yeah,
Yeah,
well, I
how do
mean,
they
that's
make
what they
money?
say. That's what they
Yeah, how
say.
do they make
But the
money?
way
Yeah,
that,
right. They say
yeah, the
that.
way they
Wow.
make money is they hold the reserves, right? And they used to hold it in commercial paper, and there's some amount in Bitcoin, but like most of it's U.S. Treasuries.
But
And in
the
fact,
argument is that it's
Tether.
one to one,
So
like
it's
base.
1 to 1 to US dollar because basically what will happen is if you go to the company behind Tether and you give them USDT, which is like the
Yeah,
token,
yeah.
they need to issue you back 1 US dollar in reserve. So they hold the reserves able to like make that hold. Now,
Okay,
in
but they
terms of
don't
the
have to
fractional,
really hold it all, right? Like they could just
well, I mean, this is
lie.
where you get into this is another rabbit hole that we can spend many years going into, and
That's
I just
inflation. Okay, yeah, got it. Yeah, no,
yeah,
forget it.
yeah, yeah.
Move on, move on, move on, move
Yeah,
on.
yeah, but yeah,
I
like
understand.
just to echo onto that for the stable coins, the reason why I'm bringing it up is it's probably it's at least from a user experience. Like I get what you're saying in terms of what's the impact on the U.S. monetary supply,
Yeah,
but
it's
forget that for
not.
a second.
Yeah.
Yeah, yeah, forget that for a second. And what I'm really talking about is like the user experience from someone like China or Iran. They're able to hold their value in US dollars instead of holding their amount in yuan
Mm.
or holding their
Mhm.
amounts in, I mean, the yuan is semi-pegged to the USD, so it doesn't matter
Mhm.
as much. for Chinese people, but USDT allows them to exit the Chinese system. It's capital flight.
Hmm.
So that's why it's important for Chinese people. But for other people in other currencies, imagine you're in Nigeria or you're in Egypt or you're in these places or Turkey. So the most popular countries for these stable coins are like Turkey, Iran, Venezuela, places where like the domestic
It's
currency and
unstable.
yes, totally unstable, right? So yes, thus we have stable coins. But I think just bringing that all the way back, stable coins are kind of like the Facebook to LifeLogger, right? And now you're
Yes,
seeing
yes, understood.
now,
Yeah.
and because the issuer has worked with the DOJ to freeze accounts, and now you see they're at the very halls of American power, right? They're buying all these treasuries, and the custodian for their reserves is now the head of Trump's transition team. May actually, according to some rumors I've seen, I don't know, become Trump's next Treasury Secretary. That would be like a Dick
Oh,
Cheney. It would be a
wow.
Dick Cheney move, right? Like Dick Cheney, remember, was like in charge of the vice presidential search team, and then he was like, "Well, you know who the
Oh.
best vice president is? It's
Oh,
actually me."
wow.
So maybe that will happen. But the larger point I'm trying to make is like in the West, I think you're going to see more like stable coins. I think the European Central Bank, like they seem to be pretty gung ho on like the digital euro. But I think the United States, Canada, Australia, the United Kingdom, and all these other places, like they've made
The
it quite clear
Commonwealth
that
countries.
the
I like the
Commonwealth, yeah,
English. Yeah, I mean, I consider
yeah,
us basically a
yeah,
Commonwealth
the
country.
Anglo-Saxons, is the
Yes,
Chinese
yes,
nation
the
state would
Five
say.
Eyes, the
Yeah, the
echelon.
Five Eyes. Yeah, exactly. They're probably likely going to do stable coins. But you know what China's really trying to pick out is like central bank. It's trying to offer a path like other countries. So one other really interesting country in this regard is India, because India and Nigeria is also another one. So these are like all developing countries with really large populations, right? And India is in fact an ideological rival with China. Well, maybe not ideological, but like they are political
Yep,
rivals at the
yep.
very least.
Mhm.
Um, so the thing with that though is like India and Nigeria are also taking the same path of creating their own central bank digital currency. Actually, I was just in Brazil as well. Brazil is somewhat similar as well. They're creating this version of the digital central bank digital currency called Drex, I think it's called. It's like kind of like the digital version of the real. And when we talk about central bank digital currency, just to define that a little bit more, this is like money that's issued directly from the central bank. Most of the digital money that we're used to is bank money. It's money that's fractional reserve. It's money that's generated by banks, but it's not directly a liability of the central bank. It's the banks that act as like kind of like intermediaries of that, just to throw that in there. But the central bank digital currencies, yeah.
I'm just thinking, so our money is basically issued by the Fed and the banks, which isn't the government, which we consider unconstitutional. But if the actual government started minting digital coin, I think it might be constitutional.
Well, that's
I'm
that's
not
actually
liking
something.
it, but I'm just saying, wow, that's weird. And the Fed, and there you go.
Yeah, that's the thing. That's the thing that some people have been actually calling on. I know, like that's kind of like a workaround. It's like, well, maybe the Fed can't do this, but can the Treasury do this,
Yeah,
right?
interesting.
And so there's things to look out for. So all this to say, for the United States and the West and other places, like it'll be a CBDC, but by another name. But for these other
Totally,
countries,
yes. Like
but
ARFID, they were gonna give you chips in your arms, but now you have a phone. It might as well be friggin' shot into
yeah,
your arm. You've got the phone, you've got real ID on your driver's license. They don't have to chip you anymore. You wouldn't walk at 5 feet away from your chip. You love your chip.
yeah,
The
exactly,
chip is your
exactly.
phone.
So
Yeah,
that's
that's
the
funny.
trick with
That's
the
funny.
government there, right? Yeah, so exactly
Yeah,
that. But yeah, the central bank digital currencies I think are going to be popular for like these emerging economies. But to be fair, like honestly, the digital yuan's been kind of a disaster for the Chinese party
good.
state. It hasn't been super popular because WeChat Pay and Alipay are all over the place. Mind you, I'm not a big fan of those either. But once you have that app, it's like there's like a lot less merchant adoption. I think it shows like, if you were to do a central bank digital currency, what the failing point would be, because China's definitely been trying to push it. But the thing is like they're like the central bank in China is not a tech company. It's not like good at getting people to adopt a product, right? It's not actually really good at making like technical decisions. So I think
Yeah,
it
that's
made some
what I was
very
wondering. How is China the cutting edge? But I can see now what you're saying, the difference between like, the fiat and actually adoption.
Well, I think China's the cutting edge in a lot of ways for that because the economy is like totally cashless. Like people are very, and I do think, I mean, China's model, what I always hear from people like who come from China and go to the West, they're always like, oh, the technology here is so inferior. But what they mean is like the delivery apps aren't instantaneous and like there isn't like digital payments integrated everywhere, right? Because there's trade-offs that people here accept. Like I for example, like huge advocate of just paying for everything in cash as much as you can.
Yeah,
Um,
yeah,
you
me too.
know, but that's the thing. But like in a place like China, where there's been quote unquote all this fintech innovation, it's a lot easier to try to push through like WeChat Pay, Alipay, and these different things, and people just kind of use it without questioning it. The Chinese government is really against Bitcoin for three reasons, right? I think one is it kind of threatens to disrupt. I don't actually think they care as much about this, but it threatens to disrupt kind of the balance of like the payments ecosystem we're talking about. Like it could be a credible third option, which is even worse than Alipay and WeChat Pay. Because at least Alipay and WeChat Pay, like you can find a way to get those people to bend the knee. Like they disappear Jack Ma, like whoever knows what
Yeah,
happened, right?
I
They
know,
force it.
that's nuts.
I know. So that I don't think is like as much of a fear of the Chinese party state. But with the digital yuan, like Bitcoin is a credible third alternative to payments ecosystem if you get it right. Now, to be fair, I'm saying this and like there's a lot to work out in Bitcoin for that to be true. But that's like one reason. I mean, the other two are like capital flight, and they're just scared of like, people like leaving the country with funds because the Chinese system is all about, getting Chinese people. Like we talked earlier, right? The Chinese system allows you to be more free in terms of uh, earning money, but certainly not where you save money if you make enough,
I was
because
wondering about that.
you are pretty much forced into the Chinese system. And the Chinese system has been a disaster recently. I mean, seriously, the real estate bubble is real, and people have lost a ton of value in housing, especially in the quote unquote tier one cities like Shenzhen and other places, Shanghai and other places. If you invest in Chinese shares, recently the Chinese central bank put a lot of monetary stimulus, which actually tying back way back to something we said before is something they're a little bit averse to doing
Because
because
it's
of the history of
inflationary. Yeah.
yeah, because of the history of what we talked about. They do actually do really care about inflation, which is kind of interesting. But the part of it though is like even with that, like I've talked to some people, they're like, yeah, my stock portfolio in Chinese domestic shares is down 60, 70%. And then meanwhile, you look at something like Bitcoin, right? You would have been up
Oh,
four
yeah.
or 5x.
But they're
So
not
I don't want
allowed to
to
hold it. Aren't they not allowed to hold it?
they're not allowed to buy it. Holding it, it's this very complicated thing. It's this very, very complicated thing. So China actually like they care about the third thing they care about is retail investors are actually like a much more potent force in China.
Hmm.
So during 2015, 2016, there was a major stock crash in China. And part of the reason why is because 85% or something like that, 85% of the stakeholders in the Chinese stock market, the Shanghai Composite Exchange, they're retail investors, like mom and pop. In the United States, it's 15%. So
Hmm.
there's a lot less like, volatility, there's a lot less different things. And so, the Chinese retail class almost took down the entire world economy
Wow.
because they were playing around with shares and maybe some of them didn't know what they were doing or whatever. And then, yeah.
So how does the how what is the property rights situation? Like, say I knew a guy who was like a Christmas ornament, king in China. He bought a house that
Yeah.
I was selling, and he had a ton of cash. He was rich. He had money, bought this house. In China, he made money with this manufacturing facility. He got paid. Does he put that in the bank? Does he pay taxes? Can he do whatever he wants with that money? Like what's the difference? Is the only difference that you can't vote and you can't there are limits on what you can do, but have they completely liberalized property rights and ownership and investment wealth savings?
Yeah, so one of the things I mentioned is like there are capital controls, pretty strict capital controls. So you pretty much
Got
have
it.
to play
Okay.
inside the system. So China has been the country recently. It's been like a little bit more relaxed, but even
Because all I
still,
see in California are suitcases full of cash and people taking over, driving up property values because they're bringing so much cash out. But I always consider that an exchange rate phenomenon.
no, it's not an exchange rate phenomenon. It's the fact
Oh, okay.
they're forbidden from actually
Oh, and they're
taking
doing it, but they're forbidden from doing it?
a lot of Chinese people. Yeah, it's like it's a large part of what drives the world economy. Just to give you a quick example, like one of
Oh,
the
that's why it's
exceptions
cash.
to why you can take money out of China is that you can actually use it for tourism purposes. So, people joke about this. I go to the airport every time and I see, rich Chinese people buying, like a bunch of Louis Vuitton bags and stuff like that.
Yeah.
But that's actually as a function of like trying to escape capital control. Same thing with buying housing and all these other things. So what I would say is that in
Wow.
China right now, there's property rights up to the degree of, like unless you mess with something that the party state cares about,
Right. And
whether
it's a
that's
closed
locally or whether it's
system.
nationally.
A closed
It's a closed
system.
system.
I
It's a
understand, yeah.
closed system in terms of capital flows, right? Like the
Right.
trade-off is like you can make a lot of money in China, but
Yeah.
where you park that money, it's a premium to get it out. And that's why some people find appeal in Bitcoin, because that's one way
Yeah.
out. Or Tether, actually, in this
I
regard.
used to do high yield bonds. I was a banker in high yield bonds, and I remember one of the bankers explained it to me. He said, "This covenant here, the entire purpose of it is to make it a closed system. So we're going to give this guy $100 million, and he's going to build up his business. He's going to make tons and tons of money. It ain't
Yeah.
going nowhere till we get it back. He can put it back in the company. He can do certain things with it, but this company's going to get bigger and better until we get our money back." So I understand the closed system theory. You can do whatever you want with it, but you got to keep it in the system, and
Yeah,
theoretically makes the system stronger.
exactly. And in 2016, they had an instance of like massive capital flight, right? And then that gets to the point where the yuan is depreciating more than they would want. They got to balance it. I mean,
Okay.
they want the yuan to be weaker for the exports, but they don't want the yuan to be like super weak. Actually, one of the reasons why Xi Jinping has this weird fascination with a strong yuan that I think is more psychological than actual
Yeah, it's
economics.
bad for
But
exports. Yeah.
yeah. But in China's case, I mean, it's still an export-led economy, but they want to
Right.
eventually get into a consumption-oriented economy. And so if it goes down too much, then it becomes like kind of like if there's too much capital flight and all the people start to mass, then you start seeing kind of like Asian financial crisis kind of issues. And
Wow.
China these days is really looking for like FDI, foreign direct investment, because like for example,
Really?
Hong Kong used to be like a route way. Yeah. I mean, China's pretty desperate. I mean, they made visas free for Europeans to come and visit. They need
Wow.
tourism dollars. They just need money to flow back in, because like Hong Kong was a huge FDI gateway. And I was talking recently to someone who works in capital markets in China. The country has not allowed IPOs to go forward. So like right now, if you're doing capital markets, like the game is apparently all in India,
Wow.
because at
Yeah.
least
Well,
whatever
India's
you say
rising
about Modi,
further. Yeah. India's
yeah,
rising.
whatever you want to say about Modi, at least he's allowed. So that's kind of what I mean by property rights to an extent, right? Because it's like if you're like a mid-level person and you kind of dine the right people locally and you never do anything that pisses off people nationally, then yeah, your property rights are probably pretty well protected. Actually, it's one of the interesting quirks of Bitcoin in China is that like technically holding Bitcoin is not per se illegal. It's recognized as property of sorts, right? So China's a rule of law country until the rule of law is against the party's will. So if you get my
Right.
drift, you know what I'm
Yeah.
saying?
Yeah.
Like
Yeah.
if it doesn't meet that line, and the Chinese party state tends to be much more sensitive. Here, I mean, the West, for example, with Julian Assange, you got to really be pissing off the hornet's nest, right?
They wanna
Um,
nail you to a tree and let everybody see. Ross Ulbricht
yeah,
is actually tragically still in jail. Let's hope that Biden on his way out or Trump on his way in release him. Do you know Ross Ulbricht's
yeah.
story? Assange is so much
Of
more
course. Free Ross day one, right? We had the shirts in Bitcoin Nationalist,
absolutely
but
free one. I want Biden to scoop Trump, to steal
yeah,
Trump's thunder and let Ross out right now,
we'll
today.
we'll we'll see. And also, Julian Assange, Julian should still be pardoned. I mean, his sentence was commuted, but he was never.
Right, that's a
So he
totally
technically
different.
still has
We'll take
the commitment.
commutation for Russ. But you were in Hong Kong during the protests, and I wondered what your impression was of those protests. I know the National Endowment for democracy was there, and that's that's a potentially I don't want to make paint you with my conspiranoid brush, but the National Endowment of Democracy is basically a CIA cutout. So I always was suspicious about what was really going on in Hong Kong.
Yeah.
Was the U.S. or whatever foreign interests exploiting natural unrest? What was it about, and what came of it?
Yeah, I mean, I also have my own point of view on this, but I want to say that I don't have to offer a positive vision for the world, so that makes it a little bit easier. If you're that's one of the good things about being someone who's like, well, the system is burnt everywhere.
Yes,
But
yes.
that is something that I do think about. Well, when I was in Hong Kong, certainly there were a lot of genuinely like people were really mobilized and they were really activated. And I think the thing that you didn't perceive unless you were there is just how like the city itself almost reoriented itself around the protests. Like they had these yellow stickers on each business. If you were pro protest or if you were pro police, you would put blue stickers or yellow stickers. Like it really was like genuinely like it was a movement. um I'll say this. I know that there's like both sides and things like that, and I've always been someone who said, again, being the negative vision person, I just want everyone to be freed. I just want
Right
everyone to
on.
be freed. but
Big
the thing
snaps
with
for
Hong
that,
Kong,
Raj.
yeah. The thing with Hong Kong and Taiwan, and this is where I kind of feel like, because we still live in a world where I genuinely think you can kind of live between the binds a little bit. I mean, having said that, I probably won't go back to mainland China anytime soon, but there is like a lot of different elements where you can kind of still thread the needle. But for Hong Kongers, I don't think that's a choice anymore because of the national security law and things like that. So I do have some empathy that they would kind of, because like, who's going to protect them? At the same time, it is also a truism for me that it is very much in American interests and in all the affiliated kind of, I wanted to say tendrils, maybe that's like the right word, in order to get involved in things like this, right? Whether that's like, in Beijing, the Jade Revolution, things like that. So I always have to thread this needle because I do genuinely believe, the Chinese Communist Party taking over more of Hong Kong is a very bad thing. I want the political prisoners to be freed, those people who are just running a primary and things like that. Um, and at a certain point, it's like watching two kind of, I don't know, I can't even describe it, two bullies arguing with each other. And you gotta like, for some people, it's like you gotta choose one side or the other, unfortunately. Like some people don't have the luxury, I think.
I felt that in watching those protests from very, very far away. I thought it looks like they're accelerating China's increasing control. Like China had a certain time and they were going to take full control, and I felt like this was just provoking them. What could possibly stop China from accelerating that timeline? And I mean, but I'm not a big believer in protests. I protest. I do protest, but I feel like anything that's allowed to get oxygen, to get loft, is going to be hijacked or exploited. I mean, I'm a negative in that way. I have hope for a lot of reasons, but
Yeah.
anything that makes the news, I'm like, well, now that's on the news,
Yeah.
somebody's controlling it.
Well, I do want to say something about Bitcoin about this because people have asked me, like, is Bitcoin going to change the Chinese Communist Party in China and things like that? And I'm like, not in the way of like, like, oh, hey, all of a sudden a bunch of Chinese people are going to go out and be like, Bitcoin is the best or things like that. But actually, in the way that's like more meaningful, it's in terms of numbers and feet and offering people options. As it turns out, if you offer people an ARC, we just described the closed financial system in China, right? And like the more options that you offer people, and this is not, ideological. This is not like,
Yeah,
hey,
yeah,
we want to change
pragmatic.
China and whatever. This is literally like, if you're Chinese and it doesn't make sense for you to put your money in the Chinese system because of so many repressions and things like that, and you want your property rights protected in a stronger level, then yeah, then that's where I say, like, Bitcoin has the potential, and it hits right where the Chinese Communist Party hurts most. Because the CCP, just like what you said with the closed system, it's all about recirculating these forced savings so like state-owned enterprises can benefit from like loans at like
Right.
infinitely good
Yeah.
terms and things like that.
You're not gonna get a
So
good return on that.
yeah, so that's kind of like what I say, and you know, it kind of gets into the heart of that. Um, you know, whether I happen to have a pretty strong belief that people like I'm not saying that like the protests themselves, you know, one way or another, but that they shouldn't have been arrested for it, if that makes
Of
sense.
course
Like
not.
Ross,
Oh, of course
yeah,
not. But
yeah,
I'm
yeah.
wondering if it was counterproductive. I'm not trying to crap on it at all. And I would say, I mean, tell me if this has any makes any sense. If is it possible that people actually have to physically exit with physical cash if they want an alternative, whereas if they had Bitcoin, they might be able to just stay put and feel some sense of security if they did have to leave or if the shit hit the fan? I mean, is it possible that Bitcoin could actually give a little stability to the the population there and not feel like they have to buy houses in California?
Yeah, it's an interesting question. I like the frame of it. I like the frame of it. It goes through like different threads. I think for me, you know, the holding Bitcoin part is so buying Bitcoin and buying Tether is pretty much illegal in China. You can get arrested for
Yeah.
that. So that is already kind of like a risk. I think if you are taking the decision to get out, that is a pretty deliberate decision, and it implies some level of like thinking through your physical safety and things like that.
Mm.
Um,
Hmm.
I do think that there are people who stay in China and they use Bitcoin, and there will be more like services available for those people, kind of rebuilding some parts of the traditional financial system in some sense, like borrowing and other things. Because really, what we're talking about is a class of people who are like in between. They don't have U.S. banking access, or they can't get U.S. banking access, and they don't want to participate in the Chinese banking system. So thus, at least to some degree, I do agree with you that it gives them some optionality. Like it makes what might otherwise be a black or white question more gray. Because like to
Yeah,
your
like in
point, it's
Russia,
like,
they had to put US dollars in their mattresses just to have some sense of security. I mean, that's what they said was happening in Russia during the USSR. People will tell you
yeah,
that behind the Iron Curtain. There are still dollars there that look are silver certificates because of that. They still have them.
no, exactly. And people in China do that as well. Like they just have cash. I actually heard this really sad story of this grandma one time. I read about it. She had all of her life savings eaten away by rats. She just like
Oh,
did not store
not
it in the
gonna
right way.
happen with Bitcoin, probably.
But well, I mean, you know, you still got to be careful with your Bitcoin. But
Oh, I know.
but
I know.
but in general, I mean, Bitcoin offers two or three unique properties over cash, right? Like like if you actually do leave the country, like a lot of people have a safeguard of like gold and like cash. But the thing is like how practical is that? Because every airport in the world is going to be
Yeah.
searching for that.
Mm-mm.
So like
Heavy.
as a
It's too
means as a
expensive.
hedge to like exit the system, it's not really great.
You
But the
can't leverage
second
it.
and
You know, it's
yeah, you
like
can't
gets
leverage
bigger.
it.
The more you have, the bigger it is. Like you can't.
Yeah, it's like a physical problem
Yeah,
actually.
physically
Like
limited. Yeah.
you're like physically limited. And then the other thing about Bitcoin though is that you can transact like absurdly large numbers in and out of the system. And so that's kind of what you see with China. So for example, the United Kingdom seized 61,000 Bitcoin, but it was from a Chinese takeaway worker, like who got the money outside of China.
Wow.
And so you know, there's these examples of like people just crossing the border with these like really, really large amounts that you just, you know, and then if you do it the right way, it's pretty much private.
Yeah.
You know, again, Gabriel is a great listen for like the
Yeah.
intricacies of
Oh
what I
my
just
gosh.
said.
Watchman Privacy Podcast. He's the
Yeah, yeah,
best.
yeah. So I don't want to, again, I don't want to say Bitcoin is private. Don't take that from what I say. But if you do it
Can
a
be.
certain,
Yeah.
if you do it a certain way, it's like, I mean, so for example, with gold, like, okay, you're going to buy all this gold, you're going to sell all this gold, but like, you're going to do it in a way that like, it probably will make it pretty easy for the authorities to like
Oh
track
yeah.
you. Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, yeah.
For sure.
And in Bitcoin, like, yeah, there are ways for the authorities to track some of the stuff that you're doing, but it's like not as, you know, prevalent or obvious. And then the other thing is that Bitcoin in and of itself offers like return, right? Which is like, I mean,
What?
gold is
How
kind of
do
like
you
that.
value Bitcoin? How do you value it? What? How do you value it?
So this is the fun part for
I
me.
mean, you're saying return, but You got to tell me how to value it.
Yeah. So, okay, you're hearing this from more of like a Bitcoin maxi perspective,
Go for
but
it.
to me, it's just a function of like how many more people are left to buy it, and how many people will want to buy it, and how much the available supply is going to decline.
So it's
It's
just you're
just
saying demand is it hasn't even be demand is double what the holders are,
Well, it's
or
two things. It's
10
two
times.
things. Well, it's two things. Well, so first, Bitcoin operates on. There's not a forced buyer or forced seller of Bitcoin, right? So there's not a way to value that. There isn't yield per se. I know there's some solutions that purport to offer yield, but there isn't yield. So when I talk about return, I'm talking purely about
Yeah,
like in a year or 2 years
yeah.
from now,
Equity.
barring So my way. By the way, don't take this from me. Like I'm not like the
No.
financial advice column,
No, I
but
just wanna know because I try to value these things and it's supply and demand, and to me, if the supply of Bitcoin is it has no substitutes, that's one thing, but there's ETH and other things. So the supply
yeah.
is limited. That's my problem. It's not really the demand that I worry about, it's the supply. It has too many substitutes.
Yeah, no, I get what you're saying. So to me, you know what it is that the supply question. I mean, I understand if you consider altcoins to be part of Bitcoin, right? And then in that sense, the supply can be infinite because anybody can start a
Right,
token or
nobody
anybody
else
can
is
start a monetary
tapping it
supply.
like Bit, but
Yeah,
then Bitcoin, that's what makes Bitcoin actually valuable and the other stuff isn't.
yeah. I do think people do grasp the difference. Like
Yeah,
at least the people who are, like the even although I say that, but the ETF providers are also trying to dabble with like Ripple and ETH. I'm not the biggest fan of those, but my
yeah.
point is that like, there's a couple of things that Bitcoiners will say. I'll just repeat them kind of like as talking
Yeah,
points,
sure,
right?
that's great. I'm not a
Like
Bitcoin stuff.
yeah. Like Satoshi is missing or gone or whoever knows, right? Like we won't know who that is. But Vitalik is running around, and at any given time, he has like a pre-mine that gave a lot of privileged elites access to this money that's being printed. And now, for example, Ethereum is proof of stake. It's not even proof of work, so it's not
Right.
even secured by like any kind of meaningful like Bitcoin is secured by the fact that people are willing to expend energy in order to secure the network and get a reward back. But in terms of valuing Bitcoin itself, like taking aside the supply, so the way I see it is like if you look at the supply and you really focus on like the finite supply that Bitcoin is like kind of because of the
Yeah,
reasons I
that's fine,
specified
fine.
unique.
Yeah, it's unique,
Um,
yep.
then it's a function of how much do I think there are black swans or dragons lurking that can take down the network. And I will say this, there are one or two, and we can talk at length about them. There are one or two things that people aren't generally aware of, like the general public, but that more technical communities are aware of that could, um, like just to give you a quick example, there's like if miners all decided to collaborate together in the way they mine Bitcoin, there is a way that they can mine all the 21 million Bitcoin together. But it would involve like all at once almost. But it would involve all of them collaborating with one another. And there's a little bit of game theory that prevents
Well
that. But that is a known
well, what
um,
about just
bug.
it just goes away? Like, governments start making it illegal to transact in Bitcoin and it's gone.
That I don't worry about as much. I think about like the technical. So for me, it's like Bitcoin, like what is like going to stop it from printing blocks? And we've seen, for example, China tried to do the mining ban, but it's all economic incentives, right? Like Bitcoin is running towards like the lowest cost of energy is running towards, so the number of blocks have been, and that is actually one thing that's different about Bitcoin than other of these chains. For example, Solana has failed technically once or twice. Bitcoin failed technically once, but this is across like an 11-year history. And that was like a very strange thing that was fixed. And anyways, whatever. I don't even want to say it was a failure, but Solana literally had like downtime, just to give you an
Yeah.
example. So I think about it from a technical perspective. I don't know. The government situation, I think of it more as I think governments are probably more likely to try to co-opt it such that
Yes,
the
I
majority of
agree, yeah.
users will receive kind of a branded
Yeah.
Bitcoin experience. So for example, what you're kind of seeing, like if most people buy Bitcoin using know your customer exchanges that comply with the Bank Secrecy Act, if most people, are transacting between each other on Binance or Coinbase or what have you, then what is the functional difference between Bitcoin and like captured state money? I don't really know, right? Um, but I think that's much more likely.
Yeah,
In terms of
it's
governments,
definitely yeah, it's
yeah,
definitely designed the way gold is, which is it's and I know that you're turning into a pumpkin shortly, so I'll let you go, but, I feel like it was designed to be like gold in that, yes, there are substitutes, but it is the commodity that is the most suited to being money. The
yeah,
more the more you mine it, the harder it is to mine. So gold is naturally still in the ground because we haven't had enough demand to get it all out of the ground. So and I actually had
yeah,
this thought about Bitcoin as being if you've ever read the 2010 Rockefeller Foundation technology thing where there's 4 futurist scenarios, one is lockstep, and that was people were focusing on that during COVID, but there was another one called Hack Attack where they said like governments really lose their power and you end up with foundations, which in my mind is like a, corporate private kind of world government.
sure.
The foundations are the de facto governments. And I'm thinking now that they've got this guy in treasury, they've got Elon heading literally the government department called Doge. Did you see that?
Yeah, yeah, I saw that.
Doge.
Yeah,
So I'm like, okay, so maybe our government is now like a de facto, private enterprise run by these guys, and Bitcoin will be the currency of this de facto world government, private world government. I mean, it's possible. Go back and read Hack Attack. I'll put it in the show notes.
but
So I don't think it's going anywhere. And I think even if it has sketchy origins, that's even more proof that it's not going anywhere. That it was put there for a
yeah.
reason.
Well,
Uh,
another black swan that people in Bitcoin talk about is maybe this was all created by the CIA, and then they're going to reveal themselves 10 years later and solve the
oh,
budget deficit.
but yeah,
But that
but
would
why
be,
would they create it? Yeah, they would create it for a reason. That makes me think it
but
has more value.
that's me being what did Sailor say or someone said, a paranoid crypto anarchist or whatever. But
Yeah, but it doesn't
yeah,
matter if it doesn't even matter as far as my only
yeah,
concern would be valuation and if it's going to stick around. So I'm going to let you. I want to do 2 things. I want you to tell people how they can read your stuff, both the book and everything. And I want to do something I've never done before. I'm going to let you go, and with your permission, the foreword of this book is only it's a few short pages. I want to let you go and then read that forward because I think it's a really nice
yeah.
it lays out what to expect from the book in a very elegant and short way. So I'd like to do that with your permission. But first you wrap up and then I'll do that. It'll only take 2 minutes, 5 minutes for me to read it.
Yeah, no, Monica, really appreciate you having me on the show. Forward is a great forward by Alex Gladstein that really goes into, the intricacies of the book, kind of a lot of the things we talked about. Really enjoyed this episode. People can find me, I prefer mostly Nostr these days, although I don't know how many people on the show use it, but Loki at nostr-verify.com. If you're just, your normal internet
LOKI.
user, yeah, Loki, like the
Yeah.
trickster
Yeah.
god, the Norse
The Viking.
trickster
Yeah.
god.
Uh-huh.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. And then, if you're just, at Roger H 1991. Sorry, Gabriel, I failed the privacy test. Everybody knows my birth year now, but I'm at Roger H 1991, and those are kind of the 2 places. The book is available. It's available on Amazon and Bitcoin Magazine. But actually, probably the funnest option is if I'm ever in your city. Like I do post about that on Twitter or X, I guess now they call it. And so I know that's another rabbit hole I can go a whole hour on the whole Elon thing. But anyways, I wrote quite a few articles
Defo rabbit
critical of
hole.
Elon. I wrote quite a few articles critical of Elon, so if people want to have some fun with that, you can always look up my articles. But yeah, and then the book is available in those places. But the funnest is probably in person, and otherwise, yeah. I mean, Monica, this is great. I do probably have to head off because it's getting dark here, and I think I'm waiting for someone who may or
I
may not
know.
burst in
I
any
know.
second now. But really appreciate the time that we spent,
Thank you
Monica.
so much. If you should exit, but if you're let me just make sure that your recording is uploaded. I think it'll be fine. You should exit, get out of here. I'll email you if I don't have your recording uploaded. And I'm gonna go ahead and read this introduction if you don't mind. It's very short. And I think it's a forward. And I
Yeah, it's a
think
forward,
people will
yeah.
enjoy it. And that's the way I'll wrap it up. Thank you so much, Roger. Send me all anything you want to put in the show notes and keep in touch. Anything you want to share with my audience, my door is always open to you.
Monica, really appreciate this conversation. Really appreciate just like all the different questions and threads we unpacked.
Super fun. Thanks, Roger.
Have a good one.
Okay, guys, so I do want to read this forward from the book. It's Would Mao Hold Bitcoin, the Past, Present, and Future of Bitcoin in Techno-Nationalist China. That's this book by Roger Huang, with whom we just had a ranging and interesting conversation. So let's just see what the book is about. Roger Huang has written a uniquely insightful book about money, control, China's role in the history of currency, and surprisingly enough, in Bitcoin. Today, the Chinese Communist Party are known as currency manipulators, famous for keeping the RMB weak over the past few decades to boost exports in order to become the world's manufacturing factory for everything. But hundreds of years ago, as Huang explains, Chinese emperors made even bigger changes to the medium of money. First, by minting coins backed by precious metals, and then later, in the time of the Mongols, removing that backing, leading to printing massive sums of paper notes. The ensuing hyperinflation would end one empire and start another. In more recent history, in the early 20th century, inflation would lead to the end of the nationalist project in China, with frustration over carrying clumps of useless notes in wheelbarrows, leading in part to the rise of Mao Zedong and the Communist Project. Mao's inner circle called inflation the scourge of capitalism and turned to organized force to tame the rising cost of living. The chairman tried to keep inflation down through violence by imposing consumption limits, price controls, and strict social norms around spending. When these controls were eventually lifted, inflation spiked again, and this led in part to the social frustrations that boiled over into Tiananmen Square. One can argue that the struggle over inflation has defined the last millennia of Chinese politics. Over the past 30 years, the most recent Chinese leaders, including Emperor Xi Jinping, have pursued what Huang calls a techno-nationalist policy, seeking to use cutting-edge technology to cement control and surveillance over the world's largest population. The idea is essentially that it's okay for citizens to take advantage of the capitalist system, to live long and prosper, as long as they don't criticize the government. As soon as they do, it's all over. The CCP uses new tools like AI surveillance, social credit, and central bank digital currencies to try and keep itself afloat in an increasingly electronic age. In a way, Xi Jinping is trying to do what Mao did, except by replacing some of the violence with technology, replacing police with self police and thought police. If techno-nationalism is Xi Jinping's thesis, then Huang shows that Bitcoin is the antithesis. Antithesis. He paints a vivid story of China's paradoxical role in the rise of Bitcoin as the birthplace of mining, with the two largest miners and mining pools originating in China, and the largest early exchanges originating in China. Fast forward to 2024, and the largest cryptocurrency exchange in the world, Binance, was founded in China by a person whose father had fled the Cultural Revolution for being too much of an intellectual. In the same way, Huang tells us Bitcoin has, for the most part, been chased out of China. Binance has since been banned, while F2 Pool and Ant Pool now operate outside the country. Intense controls have been placed on the ability of citizens to exchange RMB for BTC, and mining has formally been banned. Bitcoin still survives, but in an underground network of P2P markets and minimalist message boards. The largest Mandarin language Bitcoin podcast operates outside of the country. Abroad, Tiananmen Square survivors have raised money for projects in Bitcoin, while their names and presence are forbidden on the mainland. In the following pages, Huang will take you on a fascinating ride through the centuries and decades, showing how Chinese history teaches us much about the choice now in front of world leaders today. Do they try and emulate Xi Jinping and create an economy of control? Huang says that Bitcoin offers a backdoor for individuals within a country and ultimately countries themselves to break from this framework. But will they follow that? What is certain is that the Chinese Communist Party, in its current form, would be against a Bitcoin standard. The CCP needs censorship, control, and closed capital markets to survive. Bitcoin is the complete opposite: free speech, private property, and open capital markets. So, will the CCP succeed in squashing Bitcoin, cutting itself off from the outside world, or will Bitcoin survive, growing slowly but inevitably as a resistance economy inside China? The first step to knowing is reading this book. That was Alex Gladstein, April 2024. So I didn't get into that stuff at all. I like the backstory. I like an intro, and I like to get to know the person. So I highly recommend this book. And Gabriel Custodia, you could also listen to Roger's conversation with him. I'll put that in the show notes as well. And he's a good writer, and it's an interesting story. So that was Roger Huang's Would Mao Hold Bitcoin: The Past, Present, and Future of Bitcoin in Techno-Nationalist China. And thank you so much for listening. I just love getting outside my comfort zone, especially with somebody who's got the patience to listen to my questions, which I don't know if they were dumb or not, but these are the things I wonder about. And he was very helpful and nice to answer. And he's in like El Salvador, so it was a little tricky to get that audio working. Glad you guys were here for it. Thank you so much. See you next time. This is Monica Perez.